You're listening to a podcast from DCT Audio. I'm Dave Thomas, and I've been producing audio content for over 10 years. Thank you for listening to this edition of the programme. I do hope you enjoy it. For several years now, the levels of mental health and well-being within the UK police have been in decline. Many will argue that this is a result of an ever-increasing workload, a reduction in capacity and experience, underfunding, and a perception that social and mainstream media proactively portray a negative narrative of law enforcement within the UK. Additionally, lenient sentencing, poor organisational practices, and the disproportionate time spent on officers under investigation have contributed to create a perfect storm. In this short series of podcasts, I will be looking at the rising trend of police officers taking their own lives. I will be speaking with a variety of people to put a spotlight on police suicide, the reasons behind it, and hopefully how we can halt its rise. Well, hello, this is the first podcast we've done in a good while with my good friend Richard Horton. How are you, Richard?
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, it has been a good long while since we've done any podcasting, but we've got something I think that's well worth talking about today.
Indeed, and you've been quite busy in the political sphere of Lancashire.
Yes, I've since leaving police, well, as you know, first I've baked a lot of croissants for Sainsbury's, but I've just finished doing that, and now I'm working as a constituency caseworker for a local MP.
Brilliant. Well, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by former police officers, we're all former police officers, retired, by Michael Brown. And if you follow Michael on social media, in particular Twitter, you might know him as the mental health cop. Michael, hello.
Hello, good morning, gentlemen. How are you doing?
We're very well, thank you. Michael, maybe you just, for people that aren't aware of you or don't know of your background, you became a bit of a subject matter expert on the Mental Health Act, but just give us a quick overview of your service, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I've just finished almost 27 years. You know, I was one of those kids who grew up wanting to be a cop, and I joined in 1998. I've basically been operational 24/7 most of my operational career, but as you hinted around my subject matter interest, I got involved in policy and practice and training work around mental health responses, mainly because my force had a controversial death in police custody, and I was at the time doing a bit of research on what we do in custody with people who are brought in who are mentally ill. As you both know, that if you know two more things than everybody else in policing, you're suddenly an expert. And I was given an exciting career development opportunity to work at headquarters, which, it kind of set me on the way to being able to spend a lot of time really digging into this topic that I had become interested in. There's no doubt I was genuinely kind of obsessed about why things don't quite work and how the police view things. And crucially, of course, the law, because as a cop, I'm not clinically qualified and was never kind of looking at it from that sort of angle. And I got really interested in why we don't really get much training and why mental health professionals don't get much training either on the legal stuff. And within that, a lot of things go wrong where people think police can do things that common sense might tell you is necessary, but actually the law's not predicated necessarily on common sense. So within all of that, I just became interested in it. It became a career-long interest, and it got me to spend 5 years at the College of Policing. I was seconded from my force to the College of Policing to write national guidelines, basically based on my blog, if I'm honest. And eventually by 2014, the query was, can you turn your blog into guidance and come to the College of Policing and write some training packages that work with that? So I did that until 2019. And for the final 5 years of my service, I was back 24/7 doing, critical incident, public order, firearms command.
Well, you mentioned your blog, and that very nicely brings me on to an article you wrote, I believe, in June of this year concerning police suicide. It's a topic that is really under the spotlight, I suppose, in the media, and for good reason. Just tell us a bit about the blog and some of the things that became apparent to you.
My angle of interest around policing and mental health was mainly around how the police respond to incidents involving members of the public who are mentally ill. But of course, you can't be interested in that for very long before you realise that actually as Peel said, the police are the public are the police. Some of the stuff that the police are responding to involves them responding to colleagues who are in crisis or in difficulty. I know colleagues that were detained under Section 136 when they were at a really difficult point. I know police officers who died by suicide. And as we've all seen this year in particular, there's been an awful lot of news coverage around police suicide in different forces around the country. My perception certainly is, I don't know if you guys would agree, that the numbers seem to be accelerating. We don't really know whether they are, of course, because not all police forces actually record data about how many of their officers die by suicide, and that's one of the problems we've got in understanding the topic. But I was motivated to write the blog because of my perception that it's becoming more of an issue, but also because in the work that I did, especially when I was at the College of Policing, I did get involved formally in some work that was about police well-being, police mental health, and indeed police suicide. And so the blog's an attempt to just rattle through some of those points about, we don't really know how much police suicide there is because of the recording problems and the national collation of those data. And it was also putting some stuff out there that I probably mentioned on the blog before, but I thought, some of the things that police officers said to the mental health charity Mind back in about 2014. What do we know about police mental health and suicide? What do we know about, for that matter, ambulance, fire, Coast Guard? And it turns out we don't know very much. There's not very much published research around it. So Mind then went and did some of their own. They ran online surveys, they ran focus groups, they did some one-to-one follow-up. And eventually there was a meeting I was at in London where the director of research for Mind presented their findings to a group of people, and it included a senior representative from police, fire and ambulance, as well as the others. The police stood out by a calendar mile as being different. The results coming back, the things being said by officers about the police were a good degree worse than the things that were being said, by example, from paramedics about the ambulance service or firefighters about the fire brigade. And as a consequence, you really could see the fire and ambulance leads sort of nudging each other and saying, well, we're not coming out of here with a great story to tell for our organisations, but at least we're not as bad as the police. 50% of police officers had said if they had a problem and they disclosed it to the line manager, they anticipated that the line manager would make it worse. Not that the line manager themselves personally would necessarily make it worse, but the organisational things that have to happen, whether it's occupational health referral, or if my officer on my response team, for example, if I'm the sergeant, if they're telling me they've now got depression and they're seeing their GP, they're on medication, can they still hold a driving grade? Can they still carry a taser? Can they still work night shifts? And some officers had given examples of where the moment they disclosed that they were suffering from depression, their career had been altered for them by the organisation. 90% of officers said they wouldn't inform their line manager if they had an option. If they could keep it private and manage it privately, they would prefer that option because they feared career-altering, if indeed not life-altering, consequences of making the disclosure. But it led, eventually to the Blue Light programme, what they called their standard offer to bodies and organisations that they work with, of a helpline, literature that can be left in police stations and ambulance stations and so on. It led to various support networks kind of being offered up for the duration of the funding. And that was a route to get some support that doesn't have to go through a line manager or occupational health. It was a route to confidential support and advice. Final point on the Blue Light bit, the thing that interested me about it when I was watching this unfold, we were seeing, stories emerging on social media and on force internal networks, certainly in my own force that was true, where somebody brave and kind enough to stand up and tell their story was saying how it was that they got themselves to a position where they were struggling with their mental health. And I couldn't help but notice that all of the stories were, if you like, predicated on either personal problems in their life, or it was a story about how all the violence and the death and the blood and the horror and the trauma that we see as police officers is what had affected somebody's mental health. Of course, we know for a fact that exposure to traumatic incidents can indeed have a really negative effect on some people's mental health, and for some that becomes pathologizing. But what was absent the whole story was this stuff that had been hinted at in those percentage figures I've just given, which is that the organisational contribution to people's poor mental health was just totally missing from the story. It's almost as if the police organisation has a neutral effect on all of this. And we know that's not true. And that kind of bothered me. So in the blog, I made a completely hypothetical example of Superintendent so-and-so has made life really, really difficult for officers who are struggling with their mental health by a really intransigent attitude towards what could be done to support people. Or officers saying, I suffer from my mental health because my sergeant's a bully. Because we know most sergeants are not bullies. They're capable, professional people who are trying to support their officers. But we know there are some. because, we've seen them, we know the examples. And that kind of story was kind of absent. And it just meant that the whole thing for me just lacked a complexity or a depth as to what exactly it is that contributes to organisational difficulties. We know from Preventing Future Death reports that some people who have died, coroners have said that the organisational response to police officer well-being was a contributing factor. So it was with all of that kind of washing around my head again in light of this year's really sad events that I thought a blog just pulling that all together might be helpful. And it seems to have been read a bit more than most of my blogs are these days. So it seems to have struck a chord.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a hell of a lot to